A couple minutes for everyone to we'll give a few minutes for everyone to go ahead and chime in. We're so happy that all of you have joined us today for this conversation with Pastor Kevin Adams, who is the author of The Gospel in a Handshake, Framing Worship for Mission. So we're glad that you're here with us today. My name is Jeremy Simpson, and I have the privilege of serving as a worship catalyzer for Worship Ministries with the CRCNA, and it's our joy to be a ministry of networking, strengthening, and resourcing for so many in the church, especially in our beautiful denomination. It is our privilege to welcome Reverend Dr. Kevin Adams. Kevin is a Kalamazoo native. I'm actually here in Kalamazoo, Michigan. So Kevin, we're glad that you are able to join on this conversation today. Kevin serves as the founder and pastor of Granite Springs Church in Lincoln, California, and he is also the author of The Gospel in a Handshake, Framing Worship for Mission. And so we are excited to have this conversation today. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us this afternoon, as well as Mrs. Laura Myring, who's also part of the worship ministry staff. She serves as our administrative coordinator, and she is an amazing person. She's handling tech today for us. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, Kevin, for being here. Kevin, I want to start this conversation today, and I would like to just ask a question. I want to talk about frames. This book is all about frames. It's all about these letters to this worship leader, Jordan, and I would love to hear more about those frames as we're increasing our missional IQ, as we're trying to understand the ways that worship and mission intersect. Tell us about frames. Tell us about the importance of frames in the gospel in a handshake.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Let me just say, when you invited me to this conversation, I was all in already. But then when you said you were from Kalamazoo, I mean, come on, I had to do this. So I'm just really delighted to be in this conversation. And thanks to all the folks joining in. Yeah, we didn't invent this idea of frames. We were participants in it at our congregation. We began our church believing, really, we never wrote a white paper on it. We never did a study on it, but we had the sense that the worship that we inherited from the ages, from the church of the centuries, was not in missional in its bones. It didn't have mission in its bones. And so what we did was we set aside a lot of the parts and pieces of that worship service, like weekly Eucharist and the blessing at the end of the service, and even confession and assurance along the way, using Psalms, a whole pile of things we set aside, believing they weren't the kind of thing that could engage someone who's new to the faith or had doubts or so. But then we came on this idea of frames. It had been modeled in different ways. It goes by different names. Sometimes people talk about it being mortar between the bricks of the service. Sometimes people talk about it being sort of the sinews or the ligaments between the bones. But we came on this idea and we started to work this idea, and we really found the beautiful ability of frames to invite people in a simple, hopefully brief kind of way, invite people into the historic elements of the worship service, you might say, in a way that's really inviting and full, just overflowing with mission. It's not like we made these elements missional. They were already missional. We just kind of opened up and let people see them for what they really are.
Sorry about that. I was unmuting myself. One of the things I love in these descriptions of some of the frames that you've mentioned is the benefit that they have to our worship experience and the ways that they help to shape and mold what that looks like. Can you talk a little bit about the missional piece of frames, and why is that important as it relates to worship? Because as I look at this book, I think of so many people that could really use the great resource that it is to have a deeper understanding of different elements of worship, what it looks like for worship to be a part of your everyday liturgy in life. But I'd love to hear more from the person, the author behind, who is this book for? Is it for just worship leaders? Is it for just worship planners and pastors? Or is this book a resource that's widely available for the church? How would you describe that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jeremy. When I wrote it, the idea, and I was encouraged by a number of folks, and we he had this idea that it would especially serve worship leaders, and broadly define worship leaders at the beginning of their journey, at the end of their, or at the end, who are veterans in their journey, worship leaders who are sort of in the formal churches or informal churches from a variety of settings. But what I really appreciated, my friend Neil Pleniga, when I asked him to endorse the book, he said something like every Christian worshiper should read this book. And then my friend Melanie Ross, who's a seminary professor, she said basically the same thing. And it was almost like that was new to me in some strange way. But I think intuitively, I wrote the book so it would be accessible to people of all different backgrounds. So you can imagine, I've heard stories about people using this with their youth group as a way to say, this is what mission is about, and this is what worship is about. I've heard of people using it with their elders and deacons, their council, and their leaders as a way to say, here's a way to enter into the conversation. And of course, worship leaders and pastors have used it as well. So, oops, did we lose you? So anyway, oh, you're there. So I think it has wide-ranging benefit for conversations in a lot of different settings. I'll just put it that way. Yeah, I'm excited. And so thanks for asking that question.
I was unmuted that whole time, and I was saying some really good stuff.
And you were eloquent. I could just tell just by looking at you, you were eloquent. But now
No,
you'll have
that's
to be
okay.
eloquent all over again.
That's right. It's okay, though. I was saying that one of the things that I feel like is super helpful with this book is it's such an easy way to grasp some of the church nuances, as I call them. For those of us that were raised in church, a lot of these things that you described, we would have an understanding. But for those that, like you said, it's a book for anyone who worships, regardless of where they are on their worship journey. And I think it's super helpful for helping us to glean and understand just the importance of what a daily liturgy looks like. And I just want to kind of hone in on that, because I think as we think about worship and liturgy, we often think about just the liturgy that takes place amongst the gathered community inside of the four walls. But I think that COVID and walking through this global pandemic, I don't think any one of us recognized that God could just show us a different way of things. And that piece of that learning of something different, how would you describe the ways that perhaps understanding what the gospel in a handshake can look like outside of the four walls of a church? So I'm thinking about, it's COVID season and we're all trying to reimagine the ways that we do ministry. There are so many helpful tidbits in this book that would be able to glean from ways of understanding how worship not only defines the way that we look at liturgy, but how it provides for us an opportunity to really look at all of our life as a part of our missional liturgy, if you will, together. And so I just would like to let you talk a little bit about what does that seem to glean for us in worship and witness in a COVID season where folks are trying to figure out, how do we navigate all of these pieces of worship life within the church currently? How has that been for you, and what would you offer from the gospel in a handshake for those of us that are on this side of it? You're on this side of it too, because you're leading a congregation in a COVID season also.
Absolutely. And to your point, we've, like every other church in North America and around the world, have had to pivot a number of times. You pivot to online services, or then the recorded services, or then live streaming. And like everyone else, we've had a lot of pivots along the way. Yeah, to the heart of your question, I think one wise person said there's two ways to think about worship. And one is worship as being expressive. You know, you come in, you feel joyful, or you come into the service and you feel sad, or you come in and there's this national chaos going on, or there's this national conversation, and you express your ways of what you think about that. And that's really good. And that's really healthy. It's also true in the best of circumstances, I think, that worship is formative. It forms us. So we lament even if we don't feel like lamenting, or we may praise even if we don't feel like praising, or we confess our sins when we don't feel like confessing our sins, or we pass the peace when Lord knows we had a fight with our wife or husband or child on the way to church, and we don't want to do that. So the historic liturgy has this formative genius to it. I think Of course it does, because it follows the Gospels in that pattern and in that mojo, you could say. So it has that built in, but I think that helps us intersect then what we experience and how we're formed in worship with our daily life. Just the other day, to illustrate this, I had a friend who said, my someone in my family is dying and they're really sad and they're really sick. And I used that thing we say at church, that thing, they said. And I was really curious what that thing was. So I pushed a little bit and said, what is that thing? Just to clarify, that those words you say at the end where you raise your hands, that thing, where you say, the Lord bless you and keep you and make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. That's one of the blessings we give, that old Numbers blessing. We also give a blessing that's based on St. Patrick's, the Lord go before you to lead you, behind you, protect you. He said, I said that over my friend, and it brought tears to this friend's eyes. And I thought, exactly. We in worship are not only expressing who we are as followers of Jesus, but we're being formed, to use the old categories, to be prophet, priests, and kings in our neighborhood and in our calling. So this person took what they learned in worship and what they experienced in worship and brought it to their neighborhood and to their, in this case, their family. And I think that's exactly what worship can do. And that's exactly how it impacts our neighbors and friends.
I love that. I want to talk more. You just said something that really sparked a thought. That whole being prophets, priests, and kings in the neighborhood. When you think of this idea of the gospel and handshake, and it gives us this opportunity to really kind of break it down. You break down the elephant one chunk at a time. It helps us to really embody another way forward, right? As we think of what it means to be prophets, priests, and kings in the neighborhood. How can we find ourselves at this intersection of worship and then community life? And when I say community life, I mean just doing life with other people. How can we find ourselves embodying another way forward to learn ways, or if you will, frames, right?
Yeah.
To learn frames that would help us in that intersection with life and worship. And when I say life, I'm thinking of other people. I think of that understanding of the first commandment. Let's use that as an example. Love God and love neighbor as yourself. I mean, it couldn't be more clear what the instruction is there. But isn't it hard for us, because we find ourselves often at these pivots trying to understand the best ways of doing that? What kind of resource would you say would be a great frame for us to live into this place of intersection with worship and also community life? And how does that look? How does that play out naturally? I mean, tell us a little bit of that, even with your story. I know that some of your story has that intersection involved in it also, but I'd love to hear more about that. I think those that are with us would like to hear that too.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. That's such a wonderful question. I do think, and that's why I wrote the book, as a way to kind of express, I guess, what I was thinking, that worship has a kind of profound way of influencing our conversations in the neighborhood. And I think about, it's one thing to think about worship as just for us. It's a gathering of us, and there's kind of a fortress that we're in and we're kind of against and opposed. It's that dark world outside and it's the world of light inside. And we're trying to fence off anyone who threatens us and that kind of thing. But I think what worship frames help us do, and understanding the worship elements, the historic worship elements themselves help us do, is say that this worship is a conversation where God is inviting us into the conversation. And if we can frame our doubts even, or frame these historic pieces of liturgy as a gift, or as something we're in conversation with, it helps us then be ready for conversations in our neighborhood. So like one example comes to mind. There's a way to say, we say the Apostles' Creed almost every week at our church. There's a way, and we didn't again at the beginning of our journey 30 years ago, but there's a way of saying the Apostles' Creed where it's dusty and it's formulaic, and we're just kind of mouthing the words, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, right? But imagine a frame where someone says, maybe you wonder who Jesus is. A lot of us have wondered who Jesus is, and took the early church 300 years to put words on who Jesus is. So it's no surprise that when they finally thought they understood something about who Jesus is, they wrote a creed. This creed may sound like it has a bunch of answers. It's a bunch of cold doctrine, but the truth is behind it are hundreds and thousands of conversations about who Jesus is. We invite you to try on this creed as we say it together. Well, if you say that in a worship service, then you're training someone after a Little League baseball game at a pizza parlor. Someone comes to them and says, "What do you guys believe in church anyway?" And they say, "Well, there's this old creed, which is a result of lots of maybe it's a little out there to say someone could be quoting a creed in after a Little League baseball game in a Pizza Hut kind of thing, but it prepares people for the conversation. It helps them sort of see and imagine what this conversation could be like. So it's not just, it's framing for new folks coming in, but framing, I think, really has a way of training folks in the congregation to have conversation with their neighbors about these historic, beautiful Christian worship elements. That's kind of one small way, I think.
How are you guys at your church in Granite Springs? How are you finding ways to frame those conversations in the midst of COVID? Are you finding that it's been difficult to do some of that? Has it been okay for you? How has that worked out in this current climate?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeremy. COVID has challenged all of us. I think one of the things we noticed is when we did pre-recorded services or live stream services, and now that we're back inside in person, the time of the service is shorter. I don't know what other congregations did, but for us, we thought the sermon needs to be shorter, the liturgy needs to be shorter, so we tightened everything, which means sometimes the frames in the book, if I were going to critique my own book, I'd say there's a lot of frames. There's literally hundreds of frames in there, but they're often a smidge too long. And I think especially in COVID, as we tighten things up, they need to be shorter. But I think those that are in there could be leveraged probably and shortened. But I think that was a challenge for us, is to say what parts of this classic liturgy are we going to condense, or not remove, but how are we going to condense them? So in a season of COVID, we can have this conversation. I think the historic liturgy works beautifully still in COVID because it has in it confession and healing and brokenness and repentance and restoring by God. It has Eucharist. It has all these wonderful elements. So I think it's really a gift during COVID, but one of the challenges is to tighten things up a bit.
So as you think about the years that you spent, from founding Granite Springs and all of your ministry background, tell us a little bit about the liturgical journey. Tell us a little bit about the journey of your own frames and walking through different transitions. Help us with that, because I think for a lot of pastors and worship leaders right now, many churches are in transition as we transition back to reopening, as some are still determining if it's safe to do that yet. Everyone's in a different space regarding what that looks like transitionally. Help us understand some of that. What have your transitions looked like, and how has reframing worked, or maybe hasn't worked, because you're learning in the process also.
I love how you framed framing there, Jeremy. That was great. About how does that work?
I'm trying.
We're all kind of consciously or unconsciously framing things all the time. You're going to have a conversation with your kids and you think, okay, now how do I need to kind of approach this so they really understand?
The church said amen.
And the church said amen. Amen. I think, like to your point, anytime there's a transition, there's a lot of things we let go, and there's some fearfulness about now what's it going to look like in this new venue. But I love what you're saying about the spirit of it. Also provides some opportunity of what's really important to us, and how are we going to talk about what's really important to us. I'll just give you a couple examples. When we began the congregation, we borrowed a lot from the Willow Creek model, I would say, which we didn't realize was based on a frontier ordo, this kind of kind of capture people's interest and then give them a sermon and then wait and then ask for a conversion experience at the end. We didn't really understand the history of where that's coming from. I talk about that in a book a
And
little
now,
bit.
was this you and your wife, Jerry, or was this a team, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I think at the beginning, it's just Jerry and I, and Jerry has wonderful worship leading and designing skills. So she served the church in 100 ways, and that was one of the ways she served the church is to help design worship services. So we had dramatic sketches, little 5, 6 minute introductions to the sermon. We had children's ministry, our children's messages every single week. We had, kind of like a soloist or guest soloist every week singing a song. So we were really focused on the theme of whatever we were talking about that day. And I think we were fairly good at it. We weren't professional level on all, musically or in terms of liturgy, but we were really solid, and the people involved did a really good job. I think what we realized over time, and so one, for instance, at the end of the service, instead of giving a blessing, I would say, oh, well, something like, glad you were here, see you all next week kind of deal, And over time, you realize that feels a little hollow, or it feels a little like less than ideal. We had seen it worked in one sense, utilitarian wise. It worked. It was a way to engage folks. And I had never been part of a church where you could almost say sometimes in the early days, a majority of people were not yet believers. That was, or had just become believers. That was just this new and wonderful idea. But we realized over time that what the new Christians needed and what the kind of spiritual explorers needed was the same thing as what Christians needed, which was this timeless, liturgy. We all needed a blessing, you could say. We all needed to confess or to think about that. We all needed a psalm in our life. We all needed to think about how do we lament, those kinds of things. So over time, it wasn't like I have some friends who started the church very similar to ours. Well, actually, they started from a Baptist tradition. So first it was kind of a fundamental Baptist tradition liturgy. Then it became more of a Willow Creek kind of liturgy. And then they took a sharp turn into formative worship. For us, it was much more gradual. We did this over time. So for instance, with Eucharist, it began on Wednesday nights. And then we brought it into Sunday once a month, and then it became twice a month, and then it became weekly. And that happened over about a 5-year period. So there's one of the advantages of being in the same place a long time is people trust you. Not everyone maybe, but a lot of people trust you. And so you can make these transitions over time towards what you think is really the deepest, wisest part of the tradition.
It seems like time really is the key.
Yeah.
Time and patience and endurance and waiting and listening to the Spirit's guidance on where to go with those turns.
That's so true, Jeremy. I think a lot of times, as pastors or as worship leaders, if we maybe read a good book or go to a good conference, or we are struck by COVID, we want to change everything all at once, especially if we're a little more action oriented. But what you're saying is there's a kind of wisdom to shepherding the church and leading the church kind of gently but clearly in a direction you think it should go.
Yeah. As I've served in worship ministry in the local church for 30 years. And it's interesting because I've found that there are at times pastors will have a certain direction that they're hoping for with their congregation. I've done the same thing. And at times we'll make these hires and we'll bring in or we'll shift our worship ministry to be a certain way, but the congregation is not yet at that place of understanding. They're not really clearly grasping the vision forward. And something that was interesting to me in the book is I love how you started in talking about yes, and what that looks like to feel inadequate, but God still wanting our yes. I think that piece is so important because the yes is the beginning. The yes is the surrender. The yes is saying, Lord, here we are. Here am I, and what I have might not be much, but use it. Can you talk to us a little bit about that yes? What does that mean? What is the significance? And what are the implications of that yes? Because I think sometimes we want to say yes, but we don't realize the time And again, the patience and the endurance and the willingness that's going to take to lean on that yes and leaning on the Spirit for direction in that. But tell us about that. What is the yes?
Yeah, that's really thoughtful. I think the yes is saying, Lord, I'll go. It's the yes of the Old Testament where Jeremiah says, I'm too young, but I'll do this anyway. It's the yes of the Virgin Mother Mary who says, really? Are you sure about this? And yet I'll do this anyway. It's the yes of the apostles and the disciples and the women who follow Jesus even to the tomb, who say, I'll follow you no matter what, even though I think to your point, Jeremy, is so well said. When we say yes, we don't really know what we're getting ourselves into, do we? I mean, when I said yes to starting a church 30 years ago, we had some ideas. There would be conversations, there would be worship services. We had some ideas, but we didn't know the journey we would be on. We didn't know who would be along for the long haul, who would kind of bounce off the church. We didn't know the grief along the way. We didn't know the level of pain or suffering. And I think in the book, I'm just trying to relay that a little bit and encourage this imaginary and concrete real friend, Jordan, as a way to say, Jordan, we're all saying yes, and we all know part of what we're saying yes to, and we don't know the other part. But if God's call is in it, that will get you every place you need to go. You can always return to God's call and say, this is what I'm called to do. This is what I'm supposed to do. And by God's grace, this is what I will do. And God grant me the partners to help along the way. Yeah. So this yes is, it's kind of, the yes is a dying and a rising, isn't it? To put it in Lent, Holy Week terms, we die and we rise, and we do that repeatedly. And that's gospel, and that's gospel ministry, huh?
That's definitely gospel ministry. I am curious, and I know that you're expecting this question, but I'd love to, for those that are here with us, talk to us about Jordan. What would you say to the Jordans out here? What would you, if you were to give some nuggets to Jordans? what would those nuggets be as you think of what are three solid nuggets as it comes to the gospel in a handshake that you would pass on to Jordan? What were the nuggets that maybe didn't make it into the book?
Oh, that's good. I'll have to think about that for a while. You'll maybe get a partial answer now, and we'll have to tag something on or something.
That's okay. That's okay.
I wanted Jordan to be every reader. I wanted Jordan to be you. I wanted Jordan to be me. Over our 30 years as a church, we've had dozens of interns, college interns, seminary interns, and then post-seminary interns. So I wanted Jordan to be them. I have a friend who is in Philadelphia, and people said, you can't do this fancy liturgy stuff in this neighborhood of Philadelphia. It doesn't work. That's for rich white folks, you know? And this friend said, let's just try it for a while. And he said, there's this group of blue collar Philadelphians who are saying, the Lord be with you and the Lord be also with you, you know? I mean, so eventually it kind of took hold. What I wanted Jordan to represent is to say, in any culture, in any season of church history, on any continent really, Jordan is this person who is understanding or trying to understand and to lead this timeless Christian liturgy. So I wanted there to be a sense that this isn't for one group of people. This isn't for a certain demographic or a certain economic bracket. This is really the main way the church has worshiped throughout the centuries. And Jordan, doing what pastors and worship leaders have done at the intersection of their zip code. I really believe pastors are called to understand history, so seminary can be a really good thing, and then to understand the mojo of the historic church and the current church, but then also understand their neighborhoods, and at the intersection of these things, make pastoral calls. And so I was trying to help Jordan along the way make these both pastorally sensitive calls, but also historically informed calls. So that's one thing I was trying to communicate with Jordan. The other thing I was trying to communicate with Jordan, or I would say, is the church is a mess often. It's a beautiful mess. It's a glorious mess. It's it's a mess that 30 years in, I can't believe you've been in this 30 years. You must have started when you were like 5 or something like that. Yeah, did you? But at 30 years, you see the mess of it, and then to help Jordan take a step back, both be spiritually and pastorally present, but also to have enough distance to say what they're doing, even the pushback they're getting, some of the complaints they're getting, some of the trouble, some of the heartache is all part of the work. And to have Jordan say or understand, I'm not alone in this, but I have sisters and brothers around the world on every continent and every age of church history who I'm doing this with. So, but the 3 chapters kind of at the end were a gift that came by inspiration from some friends of mine who said, you've done this conversation with Jordan. We think it's really great. I did have one reader say, I don't think those conversations work. And then he kind of changed his mind. He got on board over time. But the other folks said it's one thing to do this inductive conversation, but you need to kind of tease out what you think. And so I tried at the end to tease out this idea of what helped Jordan understand and all of us understand what people carry into worship. I mean, people are carrying anger into worship, they're carrying pain into worship, they're carrying brokenness into worship, and they're carrying, I grew up in a Baptist, I've had so many stories like this where someone grew up in a Baptist church and they don't know everything about church and they haven't been to church in 30 years, but they do know you have to have a full immersion when it comes time to get baptized. People bring their convictions into church. And I wanted Jordan just to be able to kind of navigate all those things, or as many of those things as we could describe in a brief kind of book. I think I maybe gave you 2 or 3, Jeremy. I don't know if I've fulfilled your request.
Those are all super helpful nuggets, and something that, I think we just got a question that came through also, which has been helpful too. But one of the things that sticks out to me as you're talking is that understanding of what people are bringing into worship. Man, that piece alone, when I think back to being a music director and a worship leader, and I used to carry such a weight when I would stand up on the platform that almost felt like I was making the responsibility of the congregation's worship my own. Right. And I had to realize that it was not my responsibility to carry that weight, because everyone is already carrying 10,000 different things. Someone is carrying the stress of the day. Someone is carrying the argument that they just had on the way to church. Someone Right. is carrying, if you're me, you're carrying the stress of getting your kids ready to come and get out the door. On Sunday morning, you've got to preach and you got to get everything together. And I used to have this idea that, man, I've got to make sure that all these people encounter God, which is the wrong thinking. It is not our responsibility to make someone encounter God. It's not our responsibility for that to happen, because God is already there. It is what I learned in that, and how I had to reframe my thinking around it, was to understand that it was my responsibility to simply be, if you will, an usher. And as I think about that description of an usher, what I'm describing is someone that's just showing someone else how to get to their seat. Someone that's just showing someone else where the connections are. And so I can think back to standing up and leading and having this moment of understanding where it's like, look, we're all here and we're all carrying things into this time of gathering. We're all carrying our junk, we're carrying our stuff, we're carrying the things that we need to confess, the stuff that we need to lament, as well as the things that we're celebrating, and the joy that it is to join together in worship. And I realized that all of those pieces were just frames, if you will, and they were also the vehicles that allowed us to come together regardless of our background and regardless of what was going on, and to recognize that here in this moment, we have access to something that is incredible and it's dynamic. And it's because we're in community together and we can share this joy of liturgy, and we can share this joy of the promise of the gospel with each other. And we can celebrate that in the midst of all of life, in the midst of everything that's happening and what's taking place. And it's interesting when you talk about liturgy, because I've noticed in some different circles, I'm kind of a denominational mutt, if you will. I was raised in the Pentecostal church in Holland, Michigan. That's my hometown. And then my bridge into the Christian Reformed Church was my pipe organ teacher. She was a pipe organist at the Christian Reformed Church. And then I served in some non-denominational settings and some other settings as well. And the one thing that has been consistent in all of those settings, regardless if it was high church or a super charismatic atmosphere, was that everyone was intentional about their desire to be involved in this liturgy that was happening. They wanted to be involved in the communion. They wanted to be involved in the different events of the church life and the church calendar, what was going on. And the one thing that was so consistent among all of those churches was the passing of the peace. And I love what I learned in that, because for the Black church, the passing of the peace was a time where we spent extensive amount of time getting to hug folks and shaking hands and just seeing what was happening in people's life. And I saw that modeled more in the Christian Reformed Church as well, where people were just greeting each other and spending time to love on each other. But I love what you describe in the book as the passing of the peace as the gospel in a handshake. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'd love for you to just share your vision behind your writing there to Jordan.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I love those paragraphs you just said. You know, it's such a gift for worship leaders to say, the whole thing doesn't depend on me. God's Spirit moving doesn't depend on me, but it's a gift that I'm here for. I had a friend, he's a Greek Orthodox priest. He came to the worship symposium a couple years ago, and I said, "What's your impression?" Because it's such a glorious, such an amazing, astounding, talented group of people. And he said, "Well, some of the people here seem so weighted down." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" He said, "Well, I kind of get the sense it depends on their creativity and their ability, their musicianship. The worship service depends on all that." And from his Orthodox perspective, it's a liturgy that's 1700 years old. I mean, it doesn't depend on him. He's I don't want to say he's just the priest. He's the priest, and he just conducts the liturgy. So there's a beauty to what you're saying. I really appreciate that. And I think it's embodied in what your question was about the gospel and the handshake. I wondered about that as a title for the book. You know, you have a gospel and the handshake, and then a COVID pandemic hits, and nobody can shake hands. Yeah, what do you do? So then I think, well, it's a good thing there's that's right, the fist bump and a handshake, the 6 foot distancing, and the gospel and the 6 foot distancing, the gospel and the fist bump. But I'm glad you caught the spirit of it. I do think it's one concrete embodiment of the gospel, isn't it? When you say the historic liturgy, this is something often we begin the gospel or the greeting time, and we're not doing it right now during COVID. It's a pretty significant loss on our part. I think we really miss it, but we often begin. Christians around the world have been doing this already, and Christians throughout history have done this. It's a way to symbolize God's love for you, and we invite you to turn to your neighbor or the person next to you and say, "The peace of Christ be with you." For some people, that's the blessing they'll get. All that has to last all week long. I've seen brothers and sisters, adolescent brothers and sisters say, "The peace of Christ be with you." I've seen parents or married couples say, "The peace of Christ be with you." And I know as the pastor, there's all kinds of trouble in that home, and there's all kinds of maybe even hell in that home. But for that moment, they pass the peace, and it's almost like you see the whole beauty of the gospel, boom, right there. And it doesn't matter, right? If you're Pentecostal or if you're Lutheran or if you're Anglican or if you're Orthodox, there's a beauty to that, which is timeless. And it's such a gift. I just so appreciate what you're saying about all these traditions really share these things at their core, huh?
And I think if we really step back, like you said, this book is for anyone who worships. I think if you really take a step back and just kind of read it with that perspective and from that lens, then that statement becomes even more true, that all of those traditions are beautifully crafted, and there are so many things that we can learn and glean from all of them that really help to shape our worship and witness more fully. One of the questions that came through in the chat was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the statement that you made with liturgy being for rich white people. I have an idea about that also, but I would love to hear you expound on that a little bit. Yeah.
Sure. I'll just say, I think in North America in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, there's this idea that the historic liturgy of the church comes with a higher socioeconomic class, or like rich white people. It's something you do maybe in urban churches that have all master's degrees, or it's something you do in an Anglican church in some moneyed part of Connecticut or New York or so. But the truth is, most of the church, for most of the church history, in most continents, in most languages, have used the historic liturgy of the church. So we have this North American lens where we think it's either the frontier ordo, which is the result, some ways, of the Great Awakening, or the second one, where people said that the liturgy isn't working, so we need to make up something that engages people, and that's becomes this interesting conversation. What does it mean to engage people? I love the spirit of that. But at some point, you keep turning the lights up higher, and you keep turning the volume up higher as a way to kind of really optimally engage people, or you're kind of chasing the next thing. You're chasing the millennials, and then you're chasing Gen Z, and then you're chasing somebody else, always trying to kind of adapt. And it is pastoral work to do cultural contextual work. But the truth is, like the Greek Orthodox Church for 1700 years in all kinds of settings has done the historic church, the Ethiopian church, the Egyptian Coptic church, all around the globe. Those have been gifts, or those have been people who participate in the gifts of the ancient liturgy. So I think when we see, it's an assumption, I think, that maybe comes in, particularly in our North American context, when really the truth is, around the world, most folks are following, not all in the same way, and it's unique to their context, but yeah, that's what I would argue. I think it's really true.
Yeah, it is.
And then you're going to weigh in on what you think. I'd like to hear.
Yeah, I agree with you on that, because I do think that it's directly affected by the context from which it's coming. And I think one thing that I had to learn about even the word liturgy, you think of that Greek word liturgios, and what it means for our life to be lived as a liturgy, is that from a global perspective, worship as liturgy in South America looks totally different than it looks in North America, or worship liturgy in South Africa or Kenya looks different than it does in Japan. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like this idea that whatever we're doing and whatever is happening in liturgy will all point toward worship of God. And I think that in the global church, there's this barrier that kind of happens sometimes between a global church perspective of what worship looks like and what the gospel and the handshake could look like here versus there. And I think if we have this understanding, what you said earlier, there's this idea that when we're chasing this liturgy, we're chasing people. We're chasing, we're increasing the lights, we're increasing the sound, we're increasing our visual elements, or whatever that looks like. So we're gathering all this stuff to, in essence, create a presentation. And I want to be careful with this term, because I don't mean it literally, but it's almost as if we're chasing people instead of chasing God. And not that we're chasing God. God's already there. God's there. He's omnipresent. We know that his presence is there. But what is the focus of what we're going after in that liturgy? Is our liturgy going for a cerebral experience that only helps us to kind of highlight our abilities to pull together good, solid, professional-looking worship experiences? Or are we going after encounter? Are we going after people recognizing that there's an encounter in community where those that are both gathered and sent are also having an encounter with the true and living God through these elements of worship? Could you say more about liturgy belonging to the global church? I know that someone was asking for recommended resources that we might have to read more on that, and I have a couple books to recommend on that also. But as we look at the American way of worship, and how our style of worship and our style of liturgy is so vastly different than other places throughout the world in the global church, what are ways that you have seen liturgy belonging to the global church, and how do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, I think like one example of this could be the Roman Catholic Church, which, if you think about the history of the Roman Catholic Church, in so many different, there's lots of things they would need to repent from, just like there's things our church would need to repent from, right? But if we learn from them, I'm really struck on vacation once in a while, I'll go to the local Catholic church, and I'm struck by the diversity of folks there, folks from Asia, folks from Africa, folks from South America, like you said, folks from Mexico here in California, folks from such a wide tapestry of backgrounds. And when they say the Lord be with you and also with you, everybody knows exactly what to say. So I think about that when I participate. I know exactly what to say because we follow the historic liturgy. And then my kids, who are now adults, but even when they were smaller, there are kids in our church who know kind of what to say and how to participate. So there's kind of a beauty to that. And I even heard the story of someone from our church at the end of the evening when it comes time for bed. This little person who's like second grade wants to say to her mom and dad, "The Lord be with you," and hear back, "And also with you." And so it's interesting how that translates to what we were talking about before, early to her concrete living, right? So I think the call, or it's really, I don't want to make this like demand language, but so much as it is invitational language. Why wouldn't you want to have your liturgy, whatever it's like, to be informed by and based on the gift of the global church? I mean, it's not like someone's making you do this. It's not like someone's forcing you to do this, but why wouldn't you want to do that? And then to trust God's Spirit in that as a gift. You asked before about resources. There's a wonderful book by Melanie Ross called "Why the Divide," and she talks about it's kind of used to be called Worship Wars 10, 15 years ago. I don't think people use that terminology so much anymore, but it kind of feel that way sometimes. But it's called "Why the Divide" by Melanie Ross, and she talks about the difference between the historic Ordo and the frontier Ordo, and she really kind of teases that out. And again, her tone, she's just wonderful human being, and her tone is very engaging and very insightful without being, sometimes people don't want to have the conversation because they feel like they're getting pushed around, and she doesn't do that to her readers.
As you were talking about that beauty that you were describing, I was reminded of the Eucharist. And
Yes.
in my current role, I'm serving at my home church on an interim basis. And a few weeks ago, we were having communion, and I was reminded of the words that we used to institute the table. And as I was up on the platform and I was listening to the words, and the liturgist was the pastor was instituting the table, it reminded me of those words that I learned so many years ago, but they're such a part of me. They're such a part of my worship experience. They are a reminder, more so for myself, and the understanding of remembering what God has done and what He's doing in that moment. And so I think that word right there, what God has done and what He is doing, is such a vital piece of the gospel coming to life in worship, of the gospel coming to life in the ways that we communicate, in the gospel coming to life in the intersection of community life and church, in recognizing that God has already done, and God is still doing, and God will continue to do. And that for me is such an encouragement, because I think for anyone that calls himself a Christian, for anyone that's serving in ministry or not, the last year and a half has been hard. It's been difficult.
Right.
It's been
Right.
weird for us in the church to recognize what it is to gather, because we haven't really been able to gather as we would. We wouldn't do some of the typical things that we have done for thousands of years. If you think about even receiving communion, how do we do that in this age
Right.
of COVID? But it is understanding that God's word is present, understanding that his actions and the things that He's done, we cannot forget. We must remember, because in that process of remembering, God remembers us. So even though we're scattered, even though we're in different places and we're experiencing different things, He's still calling us back, even in those moments, and saying, "No, I'm calling you to this place of communion with me and with each other. And I think that that's just such a good reminder for us to hold on to in this time, as we look
Th-
forward.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jeremy. I think Eucharist or communion is a wonderful way to think about the gift of the historic liturgy. I grew up in a church where we celebrate communion 4 times a year, part of that tradition, and then we'd have a week of preparation beforehand. But I love, at the one of the reformers is this guy named John Calvin who argued unsuccessfully. It turned out. I think that's always a testament to pastoral leadership. You sometimes have less pastoral clout than you'd like to. So he argued unsuccessfully that communion happened every week. And the more I think of, the more, I mean, you heard about our journey earlier. We started on Wednesday nights, having Eucharist once a month, and then we moved to once a month on Sunday, and then twice a month, and now every week. At this point, we're about 3 years into every week communion. And our thought is most of the church, for most of church history, in most continents and most languages have had weekly communion. So why wouldn't we? And it's such a wonderful gift every week. Sometimes the sermon, no matter how good the preacher is, sometimes the sermon misses. Sometimes the prayer, the call and response, the singing of the psalm, and the music. Sometimes, as good as all that is, they miss. But communion, in a sense, never misses. It's always this gift where we believe it's a means of grace, like Christ is somehow present in communion. Why wouldn't you want Christ being present to folks? And communion also has this sense of mission. I had one time in a membership interview, I asked someone, when did you know that you were a Christian? This was an adult person in his 30s with 3 kids. It was his first church experience. And he said, well, I knew the first time I took communion that was the moment I believed. Now, our theology says, communion is an invitation for believers, but there he was experiencing Jesus' death and his resurrection and his presence, his guiding presence in the receiving of communion. And that really is something we all receive and participate in. So it's one example of the gifts that can be given. And I think there are ways to frame communion where people know, because should we participate? Should we not participate? What does it mean to participate? Can I participate if I'm from another congregation? All those things, I think, with a simple frame can be done as a gift.
And it really brings us to a place of reminding us to not take ourselves too seriously and our need for grace, right? Isn't that what it draws us to?
We always need grace. Amen to that.
All the time. I want to just ask a question as we come toward our close, and also if those
Sure.
of you who are here have any other questions for us, we'd love to have some conversation on that. I want to ask you this question with your pastor hat, and I think that this one is important because I think we're always learning, we're always trying to grow, and we're always wanting to do our best to serve the church. But on nurturing a community of missional worship leaders, talk to us about that. What can we do? What can we do in the church? How can we be better at our nurturing? What are some of your tried and true recipes, if you will, for nurturing worship leaders? And I use that term broadly because there are pastors and teachers and elders and worship coordinators and youth pastors and all these different various roles that need nurturing. How can we model a missional presence in the way that we nurture our leaders, especially in this current climate?
Yeah, Jeremy, thanks. I think you put your finger on it, even in asking the is it as best you can to create space in your own life to be with your neighbors and to speak about them in a way, just simply sometimes speaking about your neighbors in a way that's life-giving. It's not those pagans out there. It's not those, right? But to embody a graceful attitude and an attitude that's for them and for their good, just something simple like that. But even, I think it might be possible in most churches to do a simple 1 or 2 sentence frame as a way to model what that looks like. So this is how we do it. This is what can happen. And most churches, you probably don't need a lot of permission to start a if you do 2 or 3 paragraph frames, you're probably going to need to have a conversation. But if you do a 1 or 2 sentence frames, you can do that. And so you embody that. And then I think a lot of times what young leaders need is they need encouragement. They need someone to come alongside them and to process. And then they need honest conversation about what they're doing that went well and what they're doing that maybe needs some adjustment or some tweaking. So encouragement doesn't mean you're always going to approve of everything they've done. But I think over time, people trust honesty that is really parakaleo, that has really come alongside someone, right? And I think if you're going to train young leaders or any kind of leaders, you're going to have mistakes along the way, just like you and I still, after 30 years, make mistakes. And so on one hand, you say mistakes aren't okay, but they're part of our growing and they're part of how we learn and part of how we mature in the gospel. And then that in itself embodies the grace we're talking about, I think.
Thank you for that. One last thing that I'm wondering if you could comment on. It seems that, and this is a question that a lot of churches in a North American context over the last 40 years have really grown, but haven't been very liturgical. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that every church has a liturgy, whether they recognize what's taking place as liturgy or not.
Right. I think that's right. That's right.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Well, I just want to say amen to what you said, Jeremy. I think we all have a liturgy. The question is what it is. And so one of the conversations in the book is just being articulate about what kind of liturgy you have and to being thoughtful about it. I would not equate, after 30 years in the same neighborhood, I would not equate church size or church growth with missional impact. There's in every neighborhood in North America, I think there's rotation of the saints or the reshuffling of the deck, depending on what image you want to use. There's ways to do that. And that's not to diminish what some churches have done, but it's just a way to say there is, I've seen Christians migrate from one church to the other, and it becomes sort of what's the happening church. And again, I think the historic liturgy is not the final answer, and it's not the complete answer to that, but it gives you a place to be settled and secure, and it gives you a place where, as you said earlier, you're not chasing people, but you're inviting people to come and have a conversation, and really on some level to come and have the conversation, which is based on the Gospels, which is a life-giving thing, and that night you can sleep.
This has been so rich, and I hope that for all of you that have been here with us, that you have been enriched as well. Thank you for taking time to join us in this important conversation. Kevin, thank you for your yes. Thank you for your diligence and for serving the church, for being a voice that really is living into the heart of intersection of worship and mission. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for the conversation. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you to all of you that joined in. If you have any further questions or need any further help with resources, please feel free to email us at worship@crcna.org. We'd love to connect with you. You can also check out the website at crcna.org/worship. You can get connected with us there as well. But we would love to stay in touch. Thank you for your time today. Kevin, as always, thank you. It's a pleasure. And we just pray God's blessings over you. May you all just have a amazing rest of the week. It's Wednesday, so we're almost out of the count here, but hope that you all have a blessed week, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Thanks, Jeremy.
You too.